Welcome to another edition of the China Forum. My name is Carrie Dumbaugh. From time to time, we spend a half hour here at the China Forum talking with a noted poobah in the China business, and the person we are going to be having a conversation with today is Ambassador James Lilley, sitting right here with me, now Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you for being here with us, so welcome to the China Forum. You have such a long and distinguished career. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to it in a half an hour, but we'll start. You spent the first 12 years of your life, much of the first 12 years of your life, in China, but when you left China, you were thinking of going into Russian studies. In college, studying Russian?
Well, I left China in October of 1940 when all of the dependents were ordered out. At that time, we anticipated war with Japan. And 14 months before December 7th, 1941, we were ordered out. My mother and I left China on the American president lines. And then we came to the States, and then I went to school here. And when I finished Phillips Exeter Academy, went on to Yale, I became a Russian major.
And so that's what you had enough of East Asia, you were going into Russian studies?
Absolutely, and I think Arthur Hummel had some of the same reaction when he went to as an undergraduate, coming back from China. You really want to do something different.
Is that right? So in 1951, I guess after you graduated, and this would have been from Yale, you were preparing to go to Korea. There was the Korean War on then.
Right.
And you were recruited by the CIA?
CIA, right.
Which was new at that time.
Yeah, very new. It started in 47, and they were recruiting all from the Ivy League schools, and they had big net out to catch people from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth, Columbia, Brown, but particularly Harvard, Yale, Princeton. So I was caught up in this net. I was just a sort of an aspiring athlete and a Russian major, and all of a sudden I was working on a farm to get my legs in shape because I played some sports then. And the farmer drove his tractor by me and said, guess what's happened? And I said, what? And he said, the North Koreans have invaded South Korea. And I said, really? And he said, I wonder if the price of grain will go up. That was his reaction. Well, it changed my life because the next year I was recruited by CIA out of Yale, and started that summer.
But not to go to Korea. You ended up going to Taiwan.
I was going to Korea, but my legs always get in my way. They were all battered from college, and they wouldn't let me go in because you had to be a parachute jumper. And I didn't do it. So they said, you're going to Japan first, and then down to Taipei.
Now, you had been in China for 12 years. Had you ever been to Taipei in that time?
No. No,
so this was your first time?
Absolutely. This is first time to Taipei. Taipei then, of course, when I was in China, was a Japanese colony.
So you went to Taipei, and I was reading an interview that you gave, and you said at that point of your first experience in Taiwan, you said you developed a healthy cynicism about the Chinese that you worked with. Why was that?
Well, I think a certain skepticism, perhaps. It was almost a looking-glass war, if you read this book by Jean Le Carré. We were trying to run operations against China, and they were saying there were guerrillas in China and they could support them with airdrops and messages and all this sort of thing. Well, there weren't any guerrillas in China. And we were sending people in there, and the whole operation, I think, was probably compromised. And also was full of fabrication, false data. And I think I was exposed to that in the first 2 years.
Now, this is the nationalist government on Taiwan.
Yeah. I mean, they were in very, very bad shape then. They'd been driven off the mainland. They had a couple of P-51s, and their army was dispirited. They just had this great massacre of Taiwanese in 47. And it was a very depressing place, and the Americans put a lot of stock in them because we wanted to start a second front in the Korean War to distract the Chinese from their focus in Korea, North Korea, where, of course, we fought to a standstill. And so we started to open up a second front in the South, and we were sending agents in and sending exploratory paramilitary operations in, and it wasn't working at all.
How long did you spend in Taiwan at that?
About 1 year.
1 year only?
1 year. And then I went on to Hong Kong University and studied classical Chinese. I got out, took my money, went to Hong Kong University, studied classical Chinese for about 6 months. My money ran out, so I went home to the United States by way of Paris, where I met my future wife. And my life changed after that. I went into the agency and joined them and became a staff officer. And then I was on my career track.
Well, now let's race through that career track for the first next couple of years. After Taiwan, you were stationed in
Japan, working with the overseas Chinese community in Japan. That was a much more serious experience. We got into the real mechanics and the patience and the skill you have to do to establish an effective clandestine operation. And we did that in Japan. I did that in Japan for 2 years.
And then in 1958, you went to the Philippines?
Went to the Philippines under the embassy arrangement. And there, of course, I was given a major...
What is the embassy arrangement?
Well, I was embassy cover, if you will.
Okay.
I was a staff officer of the CIA under an embassy arrangement. And we had lots going on in the Philippines. Big, active Chinese community, very good contacts, and leads into Chinese communist organizations and into China. We'd been able to purge it of all of its fabrications earlier. And we were trying to juggle out what were the remaining operations that were worth keeping. And there were some.
So even in these other postings, you were focusing on China. Of course, it's impossible to get an overseas posting in the PRC at that point.
No. No, and I was also working against the so-called Philippine Communist Party. I was working on that program to recruit Filipinos to work for the United States, and I had one operation going there.
After the Philippines, in 1961, Cambodia.
Then it really got exciting. Cambodia was a place where they did have a Chinese communist mission, as they called it in those days. A very active exchange with China, commercial, academic, cultural, going back and forth. Zhou Enlai had been there in '56. On a fantastic tour. They had a Chinese aid program, and we really had links into China. And at that time, you moved from the Looking Glass War in Taipei, let's say roughly in '51, '52, to the slogging work in Japan.
And these were real substantive.
To the Philippines. This is where you really got the insight into China. And it was a very exciting time.
After Cambodia, Laos, was there the same kind of insight?
Cambodia, I went to Thailand for a year, tried to get their China program going, which I think we succeeded in doing, and then came back home from Thailand, and then of course I got the big break. I was sent to Laos in a command position. But in an entirely different way. I was doing insurgency operations.
Same kind of insight into China and connections?
We weren't bothered with China very much at all.
Totally focused
on Vietnam. We had one operation
Vietnam.
which tapped into Chinese phone lines, which I was involved in, but basically it was to run a major insurgency operation against the Vietnamese in Laos, Ho Chi Minh Trail, Sihanouk Trail, road watch teams calling in airstrikes. This had some relevance actually to the Afghan war. Some of the techniques that we developed in Laos, I think, had some relevance to what's going on now.
So you take this kind of this detour into Laos, and then after that, in 1968,
I was sent back to China, to Hong Kong.
To Hong Kong.
And the whole atmosphere was changing at that time. I'd gone through 10 years in Southeast Asia, ended up with the Tet Offensive. That was the time I was leaving, coincidentally, from
always leaving
from Laos.
at these incredibly fertile times.
And also, we had a ambush of an American watching post up in Site 85 in northeast Laos, where 12 Air Force people were killed, and that happened just about the time I left. But it was a rough guerrilla war, insurgency. But then they said you have to go back to China, and it was a very good time to go back into the China game because things were opening up. You could just see it, smell it.
1968 and 70, though, was the Cultural Revolution, so you were seeing this from the Hong Kong perspective.
You were seeing that come out. The bodies were floating down the Pearl River. The remnants of the ragtag extreme leftist movement was still just began to die out in Hong Kong. Yeah, the British had cracked down on it very hard, but there were opportunities to get into China. And we got back in the Chinese game, and we were talking to Chinese, and we knew the big breakthrough was coming.
I want to explore this a little bit because you have said in interviews that Your shop was, in Hong Kong, was receiving messages from Chinese in the PRC, that the PRC was interested in opening up, and that you were passing these messages in quite a bit of detail to Washington.
Right.
And yet when I read memoirs of U.S. policymakers, Kissinger's memoirs, the White House years, I don't read about these messages. In fact, in 1970, Kissinger is still saying that the Chinese are trying to signal that there was the Edgar Snow standing with
in
Mao.
In '69 on Tiananmen Gate, yes.
Did you get the feeling that your messages were not being listened to?
Well, I think there was a flood of messages coming in. We weren't the only ones. It was a lot of intelligence. The Chinese were putting out signals all over the place, through Pakistan, through Holland, through Hong Kong, various places, and Romania. And we picked these up, and we're getting these indications. I think what we got from Hong Kong was, let's say, more detailed thinking by Chinese Communist cadre, who were saying it was time to open up. They were contacting not only us, but American newsmen, passing the message to them. My sense is that perhaps the policy people did pay some attention to these, but I think also they were carrying out their own secret contacts, starting probably around '69.
And you thought all of these were authoritative, these messages?
No,
well, many
not all
of
of them. I think some of them were phony, and some of them were entrepreneurs trying to, self-serving stuff, and you could sort that out. But some of it read very true, was right on the mark. And one particular source we had in Hong Kong, I think, was really quite important in laying out the Chinese rationale, the way they were thinking at the time.
Did this feed into the whole Nixonian Kissinger? They were writing about opening up to China at about this time.
Yeah, I do, but I think they were also getting a lot of information from technical sources and from diplomats and giving them a lot of the same thing. So we were in no sense unique, but we were on to what was happening, and we were supporting it. So I don't think that people like Dr. Kissinger would pay that much attention to an individual report from Hong Kong, because he was getting the condensed intelligence out of the analytical branch of CIA and from state INR. And I think he considered this more important. Plus, academics were carrying the message to him.
After Hong Kong, 1970, you made a trip back to Taiwan. Now, you were not stationed there, but you made a trip back to Taiwan.
Yeah, I made a trip up there because we thought that the military and even our own people were getting involved with the Chinese nationalists again to collect on China. And we really said, we've gone down this path before. And we found that the military was getting into these huge fabrications. And you couldn't really talk them out of it.
The U.S. military?
The U.S. military, yeah. And they weren't very professional at that time. And also our station, we had a very successful program in Hong Kong of debriefing travelers. Well, they wanted to do it from Taipei too. And we said, don't do it, because it'll be colored when you get it. Ours is the straight stuff from the Brits and from debriefings of refugees.
Was that the first time you'd been back in Taiwan since earlier in 1951?
I think we'd gone through there once in '65 when we were looking into big radio, and I went there with Paul Hensey under Cord Meyer's umbrella, and we talked to them about big radio. But that was a brief trip, but '70 was, I think, that was really the first time I really went back to Taipei in some time. I was only there for a couple of days.
But you must have noticed changes,
oh my
tremendous
Lord,
changes.
You could just see it was beginning to take off. It was really grabbing hold, and you could see the electronic sprawl going up the mountains and the cars on the street. It was really something.
After all of this international travel, you came back to the United States, and from
That's right.
1973 to 1975, you were the first NIO, the first National Intelligence Officer on China.
I was the first station chief.
Ah.
NIO comes later.
Okay.
This was an idea that Dr. Kissinger and James Schlesinger, who was then head of CIA, had, with my help. I'd come up with the idea that we needed to have a man in Beijing. And originally there was quite a bit of resistance to that because they wanted a pure mission. But they were overridden by Dr. Kissinger, James Schlesinger, and I understand Chairman Mao.
Now, when you say that, because I forgot about your U.S. Liaison Office experience, when you say they, you're talking about the State Department.
Yeah, I think that it was staffed by Foreign Service officers, and of course David Bruce was the head of it, who was not a Foreign Service officer, but had served as ambassador to Germany, France, and England. And he was an OSS man, and we got along very, very well. And I think we worked together well. And I was there for 2 years, from 73 to 75, and then left, and I was replaced by another fellow. I can't give you his name. But he was a very careful, cautious professional. I had been in this rather touchy situation where I was rather well known.
You were a declared CIA officer.
To the Chinese at the highest level.
Right.
But, golly, I knew press people. I knew the NBC, I knew Stan Carno, I knew the Cal brothers, I knew all these people. And all of a sudden, if I appeared in China, I'm not a Foreign Service officer. So I really sort of hid under a rock most of the time. And I didn't kept away from the media. But finally, my name broke in the press, and then I left shortly thereafter.
Still, these 2 years, in 73 to 75, you were finally, right in Beijing again. How does this, you were on the spot, but China was so isolated at this time. How did your experience actually in the capital, in terms of knowledge gained, how did that compare with your experience in Hong Kong, for instance?
I think that in terms of getting a handle on China, it was indispensable. But you had to wake up every morning and tell yourself that I'm a pioneer. Now today I'm not going to be doing very much. I'm not going to be traveling much. I'm not going to be talking to many people. But I'm going to get around this town. I'm going to try to understand it. I speak Chinese. I can understand what's being said. I read the papers. And occasionally when Dr. Kissinger would come through, we would be seated at the table with Chinese, and occasionally we'd have a banquet with them. And when you traveled, you'd get to meet certain people. You didn't travel often, but you did. But there's nothing like the hands-on feeling.
So after this hands-on feeling...
By one, 不如一见, 1,000 looks is not worth... 1,000 questions is not worth one look.
Right. After all this hands-on experience in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China, that's when you come back and you're the first National Intelligence Officer for
and that's
China.
an overt position.
That's back in the United States.
Right. It's an open position, and I had been in a covert capacity until then. And I left the Directorate of Operations and moved to what they call the Directorate of Intelligence. And we were concerned with community work, drafting papers, holding meetings, that kind of thing. I didn't find that very stimulating. And it lasted
I can't imagine why, based on your history.
About 3 years it lasted, but a few exciting things happened. I got a trip to China with George Bush in 1977, which was a very important trip.
Now, he was a private citizen then, and you're NIO.
I was NIO, but they took me out anyway under the very strong objections of the government people back here.
The State Department?
But I went anyway, and it was absolutely invaluable. We met Deng Xiaoping, we met Li Qiang, we met Chia Guanhua. It was really something. I mean, and it was the origins of the American cooperation with Chinese on developing the economy.
Now,
some of it came out of that trip.
Where all did you go on this trip? You went everywhere.
Well, the most important place, of course, was Beijing, where we talked with Deng. And Deng was introduced to risk contract for offshore oil exploration. And this led to the opening up of that area to foreign exploitation. But after that, we went to Chengdu, to Tibet, back to Hankou, Wuhan. Then we went to Guilin, and then we went to Guangzhou, and then Hong Kong.
This is quite a bit of access for the 1970s,
well, it was 16 days. 16 days, and we met a lot of people, one of whom was Yang Jiechi, the current ambassador of China in Washington.
Yeah.
He was with us for the whole trip.
So this, I guess, was kind of a prelude to, or maybe a signal that we were preparing to normalize relations with the PRC in 1979. Jimmy Carter did that.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, as President Ford said, I'm going to do this in my second term. But I'm going to get some better terms. And George Bush, who was then a private citizen, wrote a very strong editorial that when Carter did make the deal with China, he said, I think we could have done a better deal. And I did not put him up to it, by the way. He did it on his own, with his own people. But I think we'd gotten a real appreciation for the Chinese at that time, and the atmosphere had changed quite markedly since I left in '75 as when I was in the U.S. liaison office. I left, and then in the years after that, things were changing. They hadn't really gone into the real changes that took place in the '80s, but being on a high-level delegation, you got much better access. We got to see governors, we got to see vice governors, mayors, members of the Foreign Affairs Bureau. We got to meet an awful lot of people.
In fact, you briefed Jimmy Carter along with the UN
When I was NIO, I was sent down to Plains, Georgia to brief candidate Carter, and it was a very rewarding experience. He was very well read, very intense, very interested, and we had to be extremely well prepared. We were dealing with the effects of a major live fire exercise the Chinese had that summer in the Taiwan Strait. And as you know, the Gang of Four was running things. And they were giving us some really very ugly signals out of this, Jiang Chun-Chao particularly. And we tried to interpret this for Jimmy Carter. And he really listened and asked very good questions. He'd done a lot of the reading. Very impressive mind.
And yet, with all of this, with this impressive mind and with this background, you feel that the normalization of relations to China was not handled as well because of the short shrift given to Taiwan.
Well, I've said that George Bush, 41, wrote this editorial that appeared, I think, in the Washington Post, which made those points. My sense was, as an intelligence officer at the time, we wrote a major piece at the request of the policy people, Secretary Vance and Stan Turner, who was then Director of Central Intelligence, to write a piece on the effects that normalization would have on our allies and friends, and the whole issue of future arms sales to Taiwan. We wrote these two papers, and I think they had an influence, but all we said is you've got to recognize the fallout of if you get the Taiwan equation wrong. We're not saying you've got to give more or necessarily, but look at this. If you don't handle it right, if you don't get this business of the use of force right, or arms sales right, or the issue of sovereignty right, or this kind of thing, unity, that are spelled out in the communiques which had appeared, the Shanghai Communique in '72 was the key document at that time. And we felt that we should be consistent with the American position, which was essentially that as tensions diminished, we would reduce our support for Taiwan. But it was linked to as tensions diminish. So it put some of the burden on the Chinese, and that still exists today.
Yes, it does. Do you think that you have said, and I have to put in a plug here for Congress, you have said that in conjunction with this severing of relations, that the Taiwan Relations Act, which is a congressional construct, was, let me quote, one of the most brilliant pieces of legislation Congress ever passed.
In my limited and humble experience, I saw it drafted by people of really good intent. And I look at people like Jake Javits and people like this who worked very hard on this. Lester Wolf, Jerry Solomon. And they really went through it, and they argued and argued and argued, and they refined their language carefully, and they defined what American interests were, and how far you could go in terms of not crossing the line with Peking and yet offering Taiwan support. I think it's a very carefully crafted document that keeps the relationship unofficial, but keeps the security guarantees firm. And that was a very tricky business, and I think the congressman did a magnificent job, and it was overwhelmingly approved by Congress, with mostly people on the right think it wasn't strong enough. Yeah. And State Department original draft was quite weak,
Yeah, there was really no provision for funding for any kind of
No,
unofficial...
and the whole setting up of the American Institute in Taiwan, and how you continued our support for Taiwan, how we would not get involved in in brokering relationships between China and Taiwan. I mean, not like that comes later in the August communique, actually. But at that time, we had to lay out the American position without rocking the boat too much, but making a firm statement for China, and yet giving Taiwan enough support that wouldn't let them wander away off the reservation.
In fact, I'm sure Congress will be happy to take the credit for that. I know there was quite a lot of work done on that. You mentioned the American Institute in Taiwan.
Yeah.
You went back to
Right.
Taiwan as the second director.
Right. Chuck Cross was the first one, and I was the second one. And I was the representative from the Reagan administration. And they knew I had a good relationship with Vice President Bush. So I was welcomed in Taiwan. I wasn't a Foreign Service officer, which was to my credit. I'd worked in CIA, which was to my credit. And I had these political associations with the administration. I think which started me off on the right foot. But I also landed in Taiwan almost on the day that they turned down the Taiwan request for the F-16.
Ah,
So
F-16 or F-5E?
F-5G and the 16 were both turned down. And of course I landed with this thing right on my back. But the Taiwan people appreciated this. And they knew it wasn't my fault. And so I started off, and I got fairly good treatment.
Was that the first request for arms sales, or we were actually...
No, we had sold the F-5E to Taiwan when we recognized the Republic of China. And we built the F-5E there. And we also had sold the T-48 tank and a lot of equipment to the Taiwans. But then I think that this was a major step up. And they had made that request when Carter was president, and he sort of kicked it down the road and left it to Reagan. He said, you're a big supporter of Taiwan, you can handle this one. Well, I would say the community of the United States that supports Taiwan took a very strong position against it and lobbied very hard against it. And eventually it was turned down.
That's one of the difficult things in U.S. policy on Taiwan. You're not quite sure what the supporters will line up for or against.
Well, in this case, the arguments against it were stronger than the arguments for it, and they prevailed. I remember when I was in the NSC, I was in the NSC before I went, National Security Council, before I went to Taiwan, and we commissioned a study on the need that Taiwan had for a new fighter, based on the Taiwan Relations Act, which says we will meet Taiwan's legitimate needs. Well, the Defense Department came back and said they don't need it. China's got these F-15s, F-17s, F-19s, which are not good airplanes. And they've got the F-5E, which is a very good airplane. So why go into the dangerous business of giving them a step up?
And that was a decision you trusted. You know, I knew this was going to happen. We're going to have to leave you in Taiwan, which doesn't begin to address the rest of your career. But we'll schedule another interview with you because this is fascinating. I want to say thank you to Ambassador Lilley for being with us today, and say thanks to our viewing audience. This is the China Forum. We'll see you next time. And the character Yun for clouds?
Yeah, Yun and Shui.